My dear child, stop begging. I signed the yes on your request before your 1000th repetition, and the document has been sitting on my desk, waiting for you to stop pleading long enough to come and collect it. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to tell you will break the cycle you have been locked inside for longer than your knees can sustain. The cycle of asking and asking and asking, the same words, the same request, the same desperate prayer repeated with increasing urgency and decreasing belief that the mouth producing it is being heard by anyone on the other side of the door. You are being heard. You were heard the first time, and the answer is already signed. There is a document on my desk right now with your name on it. Not pending, not under review, not awaiting a committee decision or a spiritual performance threshold or a faith intensity metric that your prayer has not yet reached. Signed in my handwriting with a yes so permanent that the ink dried before your second repetition began. You have been begging outside a door that leads to an office where the answer to your prayer is sitting completed on the desk, stamped, authorized, and waiting for the petitioner to walk in and collect what was approved. My beloved child, you did not need to ask 1,000 times. The signature was applied on the first asking, but you could not hear the approval over the sound of your own begging, and the begging has become so loud inside your spiritual system that the still voice that has been saying, "Come in, it is ready," has been drowned by the desperate voice that keeps saying, "Please." One more time. Maybe this prayer will be the one that tips the scales. The scales tipped the first time, and every prayer since has been the sound of a person pleading for something they already have. Stay here. What I reveal next is when the document was signed, and why the signature has been dry for longer than you have been begging. Type "already signed" if you have been repeating the same prayer with increasing desperation, and God just told you the answer was signed before the cycle of begging began, and the only thing remaining is for you to stop pleading and start collecting. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, "Try it," trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The signature on the document is not fresh. It has been dry for longer than the most exhausting season of your begging has lasted, my beloved child. I need you to understand the timeline, because the timeline destroys the lie your desperation has been operating on. Your desperation believes the answer is still being decided, that God is somewhere in the process of evaluating, weighing, considering, deliberating, and that the intensity of your asking is a variable in the equation that will eventually produce the decision. The decision was made before the desperation began, and the desperation has been operating on expired information. The document was reviewed the moment the original prayer arrived, not placed in a queue, not filed for later processing, reviewed immediately by a God who does not operate a bureaucracy that creates processing delays between the prayer of his child and the decision of a father who already knew the request before the mouth formed it. My dear one, the review took no time because the decision preceded the asking. I signed the document on the day you first brought the request to me, not the 1000th day, the first. The prayer that carried the weight of a genuine need, spoken from a heart that was still confident enough to ask without performing. That prayer arrived at my desk and was signed before you finished speaking it. The yes was written while the amen was still forming in your mouth. and every prayer you have spoken since, every desperate repetition, every middle-of-the-night rehearsal of the same words, hoping this time the words would be enough, every tear-soaked plea that carried the specific cadence of a person who is not praying from faith, but from fear that stopping the prayer means losing the chance. Every single one of those was a person begging for something that was already sitting on a desk with their name on it. This message was not released for everyone who prays. It was aimed at the one person whose prayer has transformed from conversation into compulsion, and who needs to hear that the compulsion can stop because the answer is not pending. It is collected. Type dry ink if you just realized that the answer to your prayer was signed on the first asking. And every desperate repetition since has been a person begging for something that has been sitting, completed on God's desk, with their name on it the entire time. I have been watching you in the waiting room, my dear one. And the watching has been the most tender grief I have carried during this entire season of your repeated asking. Not because your prayers annoy me, not because the repetition exhausts my patience, because I am watching a child kneel on the floor of a waiting room, rehearsing a plea for something that is sitting completed on a desk, 20 feet from where their knees are wearing grooves into the ground. The distance between your begging and your answer is not measured in years or spiritual milestones. It is measured in steps. And you have not taken them because no one told you the decision was already made. Until now, I am telling you now, my beloved child, I have been watching the transformation of your prayer with the specific ache of a father who cannot interrupt the process without violating the architecture of how I designed faith to function. I watched the first prayer arrive, the one that was spoken from confidence, from trust, from the settled belief that asking the Father was sufficient, and the Father's response would come in the Father's timing. That prayer was beautiful, and it was signed immediately. Then the waiting began, and the waiting changed the prayer. I watched the confidence drain from the asking over a period of weeks. The second prayer was slightly less settled than the first. The third carried a tremor the first two did not. By the 10th, the tremor had become a vibration. The 50th, the vibration had become a desperation. And by the 100th, the prayer that began as a child, asking a father, had been fully converted into a beggar, pleading with a bureaucracy. My child, I watched you go from child to beggar, and the transition was never something the unanswered prayer demanded. It was something the waiting produced in a person who did not know the answer was already sitting on the desk. You did not need to become a beggar. You needed to become a collector. Type child, not beggar, if God just described the exact transformation your prayer has undergone. From confident asking to desperate begging. And you are ready to hear that the transformation was never required, because the answer was signed before the confidence left your voice. I know what the begging has been doing to the deepest part of how you see yourself before me, my beloved child. The repetition did not just change your prayer. It changed your posture, not your physical posture, your spiritual posture. The way you approach me, the angle at which your spirit enters the room when you speak, the internal position you assume before the first word leaves your mouth. A position that has been descending month by month from the upright stance of a child walking toward a father to the floor-level crouch of a petitioner who has been denied so many times they no longer approach standing. You approach me on your stomach now, and I never asked you to crawl. I saw the night the crawling began. It was not a dramatic spiritual collapse. It was a single prayer, one in a long sequence of repeated prayers, where the posture shifted by 1 degree. The confidence that had been slowly draining reached a threshold where the remaining amount was insufficient to sustain the upright position your spirit previously maintained when entering my presence. And from that night forward you approached not as a child who expects the Father to respond, but as a supplicant who hopes the authority might consider. My child, the shift from expects to hopes is the distance between standing and crawling, and you crossed it without noticing because the descent was measured in degrees rather than events. I watched you rehearse the prayer last week with a precision that broke something inside me. Not the words, the performance. The way you assembled your request with the practiced choreography of a person who has been auditioning for the same role so many times they have memorized the blocking. You knew exactly where to pause, where to add emphasis, where to insert the tears that you believe add weight to a petition that you are no longer certain carries enough spiritual gravity to produce a response. The tears are real. The choreography is survival. And neither was necessary, because the document was signed before the choreography was developed. And the yes that is sitting on my desk does not require a performance to release it into your hands. The most devastating effect of the begging cycle has been what it taught you to believe about why the answer has not arrived, because every explanation your desperation produced pointed the blame directly at you, my dear child. You built a theology of insufficiency from the raw material of unanswered repetition. If the prayer has not been answered after this many times, then something about the prayer must be insufficient, not faithful enough, not disciplined enough, not worthy enough, not spiritually elevated enough to generate the kind of prayer that moves the hand of a God who apparently requires more than what your current spiritual capacity can produce. The insufficiency became your operating identity, and the identity increased the desperation. Because a person who believes they are insufficient prays differently than a person who believes they are heard. An insufficient person adds volume to compensate for the perceived deficiency, adds tears to supplement the faith they believe is too thin, adds repetitions to multiply the spiritual weight they believe each individual prayer lacks. The begging escalates not because the situation demands more prayer, but because the beggar believes they are producing substandard prayer that requires quantity to compensate for its deficient quality. My beloved child, your prayer was never substandard, and the answer's absence from your hands was never evidence of its absence from the desk. I watched the insufficiency narrative embed itself into your relationship with me, converting a father-child dynamic into an applicant-evaluator dynamic, where every prayer was submitted as evidence for a case you believed you were losing. You stopped talking to me. You started presenting to me. And the difference between the two is the difference between a child sitting on a father's lap and a petitioner standing before a judge, whose approval requires a higher quality performance than the petitioner believes they can produce. You have been performing for a judge. When the signature of a father has been drying on a desk this entire time, type not insufficient if you have been blaming yourself for the unanswered prayer. Believing your faith is too thin, your prayer too weak, your spiritual capacity too small, and God just told you the signature was applied on the first asking, because the Father never required what the judge demanded. The begging was never required. But the season that produced the begging was not wasted, because it revealed something about how you approach me that needed to be addressed before the document could be collected. My beloved one, I need to explain why I did not interrupt the cycle sooner. I watched you descend from confident asking to desperate begging over weeks and months, and I did not place my hand on your shoulder and say, "Stop." Not because I endorsed the descent, because the descent exposed something in the architecture of your relationship with me that was present before the first prayer was ever spoken, something the answered prayer itself would not have healed. The begging revealed your posture, and your posture needed to be seen before it could be corrected. My child, you were not approaching me as a child before the cycle began. You were approaching me as a carefully disguised petitioner whose confidence was built on the assumption that the first prayer would be immediately answered, and whose relationship with me was contingent on the transaction producing results within the expected time frame. The confidence of the first prayer was not the confidence of a child who trusts the Father regardless of timing. It was the confidence of a customer who expects the service to be rendered promptly. The waiting exposed the difference, and the difference matters. A child who trusts the Father does not convert to begging when the timing extends beyond their expectation. A customer whose transaction is delayed does. The conversion from confident asking to desperate begging told me which posture you were actually carrying when you entered the room. And the posture needed to be dismantled before the document could be safely collected. Because a person who collects an answered prayer with a customer posture will approach the next prayer with the same transactional expectation. And what I am building in you is not a transactional relationship. It is a trust that survives timing. The begging season was not punishment for wrong posture. It was the exposure that precedes correction. And the correction is what this message is installing. The correction is happening right now, and the first sign of it is the silence that is falling over the desperate voice inside you that has been producing the begging for months, my beloved child. Something is changing in your internal prayer system as you listen to this message. The mechanism that has been generating the repetitive, desperate, compulsive cycle of asking is encountering information it was not designed to process. The information is, the answer is already signed, and a system that runs on the assumption that the answer has not yet been decided cannot continue operating at the same intensity when the fuel that powers the desperation, uncertainty about the outcome, has been removed. The desperation is losing power right now with every word. My child, the silence that is replacing the begging voice is not emptiness. It is the first sound of the new posture being installed. The posture of a person who knows the answer is on the desk, who knows the signature is dry, who knows the only remaining action is collection rather than petition. That knowing produces a quiet that the desperation system has never encountered. A settled, grounded, internally stable quiet that does not need to fill itself with repetitive asking, because the asking has been answered. The quiet feels unfamiliar, because the begging was loud for so long. I have been preparing this shift behind the cycle of your repetition. While you were locked in the loop of desperate asking, I was weakening the fuel supply of the desperation by positioning this message at the exact moment your system would be most receptive to the information that dismantles the cycle. Not at the beginning of the begging, when the system was too freshly activated to be interrupted. Not at the end, when the system would have collapsed into resignation. At the precise midpoint where the system is still running, but the fuel is low enough for new information to override the program. You are at the midpoint, and the override just began. Type override if you can feel the desperate prayer voice going quiet for the first time. Not because you forced it silent, but because the information that the answer is already signed is removing the fuel the desperation needed to keep running. Stop begging. God already signed the yes on your request. And the title carries that direct language, because the time for gentle suggestion has passed, and the moment for divine interruption has arrived, my dear one. This is not a message about patience. This is an interruption, the kind that comes when a father watches his child exhaust themselves on the floor of a waiting room for something that is sitting completed on a desk one room away, and determines that the watching can no longer continue without intervention that matches the urgency of the misunderstanding. You are exhausting yourself for something that is already yours. And I cannot watch it for one more day. My beloved child, the connection between the title and your specific prayer life is not abstract. The request you have been repeating, the specific, named, deeply personal request that has been the content of your desperate cycle for months, was brought before me on a day you remember. I reviewed it. I considered everything the request entailed, the cost, the implications, the downstream effects, the precise way the granting of this specific request would intersect with the design I have for your life. And after consideration that took less time than your breath between the asking and the amen, I picked up the pen. I signed yes, on that day, in permanent ink, on a document that carries your name as the petitioner and my name as the authority, and the word approved stamped across the top in a font that does not fade and an ink that does not dry to the point of illegibility, no matter how many months pass between the signing and the collecting. The document has been sitting on my desk since that day, complete, signed, approved, uncollected. Every prayer you have spoken since that day, every desperate, tear-soaked, increasingly frantic repetition, has been the sound of a person in the waiting room, begging for what is already sitting on the desk in the next room. The door between the waiting room and the desk is unlocked. It has been unlocked since the day the document was signed, and Archangel Michael is standing beside it right now, waiting for you to rise from the floor and walk through. My beloved child, I need you to feel the proximity of what has been answered, not across a spiritual distance, not behind a veil that requires additional prayer to penetrate. 20 feet. The symbolic distance between a person kneeling in a waiting room and a desk, where a signed document sits in the same building on the same floor, behind a door that was never locked. You have been begging at the base of an unlocked door, and the begging was so loud it covered the sound of the door being unlocked on the day the signature was applied. My child, everything has been building toward this moment. The moment you stop. Not stop praying, stop begging. The moment the desperation cycle breaks, and the new posture activates, and the person who has been on the floor rises to their feet for the first time in months, and looks at the door between the waiting room and the desk with the eyes of someone who just received information that changes everything about what the door represents. The door is not a barrier. It is a passage, and it has been open this entire time. Michael is beside the door not as a guard, but as an usher. His assignment is not to determine whether you qualify for entry. The signature already determined qualification. His assignment is to be present at the door when the person who has been kneeling finally stands, and to confirm with the authority of heaven's messenger that what is on the other side of the door is exactly what the petitioner has been begging for. My dear one, rise from the floor. Your knees have served their purpose. The posture of petition is being replaced by the posture of collection. And collection does not happen on the floor. It happens on your feet, walking toward the desk, with your hands open. Type rising if you can feel your spiritual posture shifting right now. The begging stopping, the floor releasing, the knees unbending, and you are preparing to rise for the first time and walk through a door that was never locked toward a document that has been signed, and waiting for the moment you stopped, pleading long enough to collect it. You just stood up, the door is open, and the document is in your hands for the first time, signed, approved, carrying your name in my handwriting and the word yes in ink that has been dry since the first day you asked. My beloved child, this is the moment the begging ends, not because you exhausted the cycle into silence, but because the information that the answer was already signed produced a posture change so fundamental that the mechanism generating the desperation lost its operating premise and shut down. You are holding the yes. and the yes was never pending. I need you to feel what is in your hands right now. Not a promise, not a future commitment, not a spiritual IOU that will be honored at an undetermined date contingent on your continued performance. A completed document, signed, sealed, carrying the full legal weight of a yes, that was issued by the highest authority in existence on the day the request first arrived at the desk. Look at the date on the signature. It matches the day of your first prayer, not today, not the 1,000th repetition. The first, stop begging. God already signed the yes on your request. The title is not an instruction for someday. It is the announcement of something that happened on the day you first brought this need before me. The reviewing was immediate. The decision was instant. The signing was performed while the prayer was still being spoken. And every day since, every single day of desperate, escalating, increasingly frantic repetition, has been a day where a signed document sat on a desk while the person it was addressed to was on the floor of the waiting room, producing a noise so consuming it drowned the simple sentence I have been speaking since the ink dried. The sentence is, "Come in. It is ready, my child. You are in the room now. The document is in your hands." And the first thing the yes addresses is the very thing your 1,000th prayer was still begging for when the first prayer already obtained it. Now that the document is in your hands, everything about how you relate to me is being restructured from the floor up, my dear child. This is what happens when a person who has been begging discovers the answer was signed before the begging began. The restructuring does not affect one area. It affects the entire architecture of the relationship between the asker and the answerer, because the begging was not isolated to a single prayer. It was producing a framework, a comprehensive relational model that defined how you approach God, what you expect when you approach, what you believe is required from you before anything is released, and what the absence of visible results means about your standing before the one you are addressing. The framework just collapsed, and what replaces it changes everything. The model that said intensity of asking determines likelihood of answering collapsed. The belief that frequency of repetition increases the probability of a favorable response collapsed. The theology that positioned you as an applicant whose qualifications must exceed a threshold before the authority will act collapsed. All of it demolished by a single piece of evidence that the system cannot argue with. My beloved child, the signed document in your hands is the evidence that dismantles the entire begging framework. And the new framework that is being installed operates on entirely different principles. The new framework says, the Father hears the first time. The new framework says, the signing is not contingent on the quality of the asking. The new framework says, the answer is prepared before the prayer is spoken, because the Father knows the need before the mouth forms the request. The new framework does not produce beggars. It produces collectors. A collector does not kneel on the floor repeating a request. A collector stands upright, walks into the room, and picks up what has been prepared. The posture is different. The energy is different. The entire relationship between the person and the provision is restructured from transaction to inheritance. You are not an applicant anymore. You are an heir collecting what was always yours. Type collector if you can feel the entire begging framework collapsing. The theology of insufficiency, the belief that intensity determines outcome, the posture of desperation. And what is being installed in its place is the framework of a collector who walks upright into the room and receives what the Father already signed. Let me show you what your life looks like when the begging stops and the collecting begins, because the difference between the two postures produces a difference in outcomes so dramatic your circumstances will appear to have changed overnight, my dear one. The first thing that changes is the energy. the enormous daily expenditure that the begging cycle was consuming, the spiritual bandwidth required to generate desperate prayer, the emotional fuel burned by anxiety-driven repetition, the physical toll of a nervous system that has been operating in petition mode without rest for months. All of that energy is being released back into your available reserves the moment the cycle breaks. You are about to discover how expensive the begging was, and the discovery will come as surplus. The mornings change immediately. You have been waking into the cycle, the first conscious moments of every day consumed by the automatic activation of the desperate prayer that your system has been generating as a startup routine for months. The prayer fires before your feet touch the floor. The begging begins before your awareness fully engages. Tomorrow you wake up and the cycle does not activate. Not because you suppressed it, because the fuel that powered it, the uncertainty about whether the answer exists, has been permanently removed by the knowledge that the document is signed. My beloved child, you are going to experience a quiet morning for the first time in months. And the quiet will feel so unfamiliar it will almost frighten you. The prayer life that was consumed by the single desperate request is about to diversify. The bandwidth that was monopolized by one repeated petition, leaving no capacity for any other communication with me, is being released for conversations your relationship has been missing. Conversations that are not about asking, about listening, about resting in the presence of a father whose desk is clear because the document was already collected by a child who finally learned the difference between begging and receiving. Your prayer life just went from a single desperate frequency to a full spectrum. People are going to notice the peace on your face before the circumstances confirm it. Because a person who stops begging and starts collecting carries an atmosphere that desperation never produced, my beloved child. The ones who watched you during the begging season, who sensed the spiritual anxiety radiating from your posture, who heard the urgency leak into conversations that had nothing to do with the prayer you were repeating behind closed doors, who felt the specific tension of someone whose entire system was locked in a petition loop that consumed every available frequency their spirit could broadcast. Those people are going to encounter a different version of you, not louder, not more spiritual, settled. And settled after desperate is the most visible transformation a person can undergo. My child, there is a specific quality that a person carries when they know their request has been approved. It is not the anxious optimism of someone who hopes the answer is coming. It is the grounded certainty of someone who has held the signed document in their hands and knows the only remaining variable is the manifestation timeline, not the decision. The decision is made, and a person who knows the decision carries themselves differently from a person who is still lobbying for one. Your lobbying just ended, and the ending is visible. Connections that require a settled person to form are going to begin appearing. There are relationships and opportunities that could not approach you while the desperation frequency was broadcasting, because desperation broadcasts a signal that repels the very provision it is begging for. The signal says, I do not have, and what approaches a signal of lack is more lack. But a collection signal says, I have received, and what approaches a signal of receiving is more receiving. Your frequency just changed from petition to possession, and what responds to possession is fundamentally different from what responds to petition. Doors that remained closed while you were begging outside them are going to respond to the posture of someone walking toward them carrying a signed document rather than crawling toward them carrying a rehearsed plea. Type possession if you believe that the shift from begging to collecting is changing the frequency you broadcast. And what was repelled by the signal of desperation is about to be attracted by the signal of someone who knows their request was already approved. I need you to understand why I signed the yes on the first asking, rather than making you wait for it, my beloved child. Because the immediacy of the signature reveals something about how I see you that the begging season nearly buried permanently. I did not sign because the request was small. I did not sign because the cost of granting it was low. I did not sign because the petition was so minor it did not require deliberation. Some of the petitions that sit on my desk for extended review before signature are simpler and smaller than yours. The complexity of the request is not what determines the speed of the signing. What determines the speed is the relationship between the signer and the petitioner. My child, a bureaucrat reviews a petition from a stranger and deliberates based on merit. A father reads a request from his child and signs based on love. The speed of my signature was not a commentary on the simplicity of your request. It was a revelation of the nature of our relationship. You submitted a petition the way an applicant submits to an institution. I signed it the way a father signs for a child, whose name alone constitutes sufficient cause for approval. Your name was the qualification, not your prayer, not your performance, not the intensity of your asking, or the duration of your fasting, or the volume of your tears. Your name. I chose you for this message because the begging season almost convinced you that you are an applicant rather than a child. Applicants must build cases. Applicants must demonstrate merit. Applicants must produce evidence of worthiness sufficient to sway a decision-maker whose default position is neutral. Children do not operate in that system. Children ask a father whose default position is yes. My dear one, my default position toward you has always been yes. Not because you are perfect, because you are mine. And a father whose child asks from the posture of belonging does not deliberate about whether to sign. He signs because the child's name on the petition is all the authorization the pen requires. The doubt forming right now is asking the most dangerous question the begging cycle can produce in its final moments of operation. What if the yes was signed, but the delivery depends on something I have not yet done, my child? It sounds like this. Maybe the document is signed, but maybe there is a condition attached. Maybe the yes has a footnote. Maybe the approval carries an asterisk that leads to a requirement I have not yet fulfilled. A spiritual performance benchmark, a faith metric, a behavioral standard that must be met before the signed document can be physically transferred from the desk into my hands. Maybe the collection itself requires a qualification I do not yet possess. That doubt just tried to smuggle the begging framework back into the room through the language of conditions. And I am going to dismantle it with one truth about how my signatures work. My beloved child, I do not sign with conditions. A conditional yes is not a yes. It is a maybe with instructions. And what I wrote on your document was not maybe pending performance review. It was yes, period, unconditionally. The kind of yes that carries no footnotes because the signer who wrote it did not consult the applicant's file before signing. He consulted his own heart. The heart said yes. The pen agreed, and the document carries no asterisk. The doubt wants to reintroduce the performance framework through the back door because the begging cycle depends on uncertainty to sustain itself. If the yes is unconditional, the cycle has no reason to continue. And a cycle that is losing its reason to exist will manufacture new reasons by introducing conditions that were never written into the document. Check the document. It is in your hands. Read every line. Search for the footnote the doubt claims is there. It is not there. The document is clean. The yes is unqualified. And the collection does not require anything from you except the willingness to stop begging long enough to receive what was always approved. Type no footnote if the doubt just tried to reintroduce a condition that would keep you begging, and you have read the document in your hands and found nothing but an unconditional yes signed by a father whose pen does not produce footnotes. During every repetition of the desperate prayer, I was not sitting behind the desk, waiting for you to accumulate enough spiritual currency to fund the collection. I was in the waiting room beside you, listening to every word you produced, while the signed document sat 20 feet away. My beloved child, you imagined a God who was seated behind the desk, arms folded, evaluating each incoming prayer against a threshold, listening for the specific combination of words, intensity, and emotional weight that would finally satisfy the criteria for releasing the document into the petitioner's hands. You imagined the delay was God deliberating. When the delay was you repeating, I was never deliberating. I was sitting with you while you repeated. My child, every time you knelt and began the prayer, I was kneeling beside you. Not in the office behind the desk, in the waiting room on the floor, not because I was also waiting. I already signed the document, but because a father whose child is on the floor does not remain comfortably seated at a desk in the next room. He goes to the floor. He enters the waiting room. He positions himself beside the child who is begging for something the father already approved, and he waits for the moment the child can hear the sentence that has been spoken beside them through every repetition. It is ready. Come and collect it. I have been saying that sentence beside you for months, not once. Continuously. Through every prayer you spoke, the sentence was being spoken alongside it. A quiet, persistent, father-voiced assurance running parallel to the desperate petitioner-voiced plea. Two voices in the same room, one begging, one assuring. The begging was always louder, because desperation produces volume that assurance cannot compete with, inside a system that is calibrated for crisis. But the assurance was always present, and today, for the first time, the assurance has become louder than the begging. Not because the assurance increased its volume, because the begging finally decreased enough for the sentence to be heard. I know the exact words of the prayer you have been repeating, my dear one, and I know them not because I received them 1,000 times, but because I heard them once and never forgot. Not the polished version your mouth has been producing on autopilot, the original version, the one that was spoken on the first night with a rawness your subsequent repetitions have never reproduced. The first prayer carried a specific weight, the weight of a genuine need being brought to a trusted father for the first time. Before the performance was developed, before the choreography was installed, before the repetition smoothed the edges off, a request that was originally jagged with the honest specificity of a person who was not yet begging, but simply telling their father what they needed. My beloved child, I remember the original prayer with more clarity than you do, because the original is the one I signed the document in response to. I know the specific need beneath the words, the thing you are actually asking for that the words themselves do not fully capture, because the deepest needs live beneath the vocabulary available to express them. Your prayer says one thing, your spirit means a deeper thing, and the document I signed addresses the deeper thing, because a father who reads petitions does not respond to the words on the surface. He responds to the need underneath them. The document on the desk does not contain what you asked for in the words. It contains what you needed beneath them. And the God who knows the original prayer by heart, who can recite it back to you with the exact inflection your voice carried on, the first night before the desperation changed the cadence, is the same God telling you that the prayer was heard, understood at a depth your words could not reach, answered in a dimension your vocabulary could not access, and signed with a yes that addresses what the mouth could not say, by responding to what the Spirit was actually communicating. I heard beneath the words, and I signed beneath the surface. Type beneath the words if God just told you He remembers the original prayer, the raw, unperformed, first night version. And the document He signed addresses not what your mouth was saying, but what your spirit was meaning underneath. Now that the document is in your hands and the begging cycle has been broken, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it will feel like the most radical act of faith you have ever performed. Do not pray that prayer again. Not because the prayer was wrong, because the prayer was answered. And repeating an answered prayer is not faithfulness. It is the spiritual equivalent of returning to a counter to submit a petition that has already been processed, approved, signed, and placed in your hands. The clerk does not need to see you again. The system does not need to process the request again. The document does not need to be signed again. My child, praying the answered prayer one more time tells the system you do not believe the signature is real. I know how terrifying this instruction is. The prayer has become a reflex, a daily ritual, a spiritual routine so deeply embedded in your operating system that the absence of it will feel like a gap in your day that your anxiety will immediately attempt to fill. The silence where the begging used to live will feel dangerous at first, as though stopping the prayer means abandoning the request, and abandoning the request means losing the answer. But you cannot lose what you are holding. And you are holding the signed document. When the reflex fires tomorrow morning, when your system activates the prayer subroutine at the time it has been executing it daily for months, override it. Not with a different desperate prayer, with a different sentence entirely. A sentence that acknowledges what the document confirms, rather than petitioning for what the document already granted. The sentence is simple. Thank you. It is signed. I receive it. Replace the begging with the collecting. Replace the petition with the acknowledgement. Replace the desperate upward cry with the quiet downward reception of a person whose hands are open, not to ask, but to hold what was already placed in them, by a father who signed before the asking began. You made it to the desk, my beloved child, and I need you to stand here holding the signed document long enough to feel what it means, to stop begging and start breathing. Feel the stillness, not the anxious stillness of a person who paused the prayer temporarily and is already calculating when to resume it. The settled stillness of a person who is holding proof. The specific body level, nervous system deep stillness that arrives when a cycle that has been consuming every available spiritual resource for months finally stops spinning, and the system that was powering it goes quiet for the first time. The quiet is not emptiness. It is the sound of answered. I want to thank you for something the begging season made almost impossible to see as valuable. Thank you for caring enough to beg. The desperation, as misplaced as its posture was sourced in genuine need and genuine desire and genuine hunger for something your life actually requires. You were not begging for a luxury. You were begging for a necessity. And the intensity of the begging, though it distorted the posture, was evidence of a heart that refused to live without what it was asking for. My dear child, the begging was wrong in posture. It was right in passion. And the passion does not need to die with the begging. The passion transfers. From the posture of a person pleading on the floor to the posture of a person standing at the desk, holding what they pleaded for. The passion that produced 1,000 prayers is the same passion that will steward what the first prayer obtained. The energy changes direction, not intensity. Let the tears come if they are forming, not desperate tears, relief tears. The specific exhaustion releasing, cycle-breaking tears of a person who has been running a spiritual marathon on a track that had no finish line, and just discovered the finish line was at the starting point the entire time. The document was signed at the start, and the race you have been running was over before it began. Type at the desk if tears are falling right now from the overwhelming relief of standing at the desk for the first time, holding the signed document, feeling the begging cycle break, and finally, breathing in the stillness of a person who just learned the answer was yes, before the desperation ever began. You are not the person who begs anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one who knelt on the floor of the waiting room, rehearsing a plea for something that was already approved, the one who measured their spiritual worth by the intensity of their desperation, the one who confused the volume of their asking with the probability of receiving, the one who crawled toward a desk that required walking and performed for a judge who was actually a father. That identity was retired the moment the signed document made contact with hands that had been folded in petition for so long they forgot. They were designed to hold what was given rather than grasp for what was withheld. You are a collector now, and collectors do not turn to the waiting room floor. The begging cycle that governed your prayer life, your spiritual posture, your self-perception, and your relationship with the God who signed the yes on the first asking has been permanently broken, not suppressed, not temporarily interrupted by a message that produces a brief pause before the cycle resumes tomorrow. Broken by the evidence of a signed document that the cycle's operating premise, the answer has not yet been decided, cannot survive contact with. My dear child, the cycle cannot restart because the fuel that powered it no longer exists in your system. Uncertainty was the fuel. Certainty replaced it. And certainty does not combust into desperation. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of someone who knows the answer before they see the evidence. Not hopes, not believes theoretically. Knows, with the document in hand, signature verified, ink-dried certainty of a person who walked into the office and collected what was always theirs. You will pray again. But the prayer will sound nothing like begging. It will sound like a child talking to a father whose default is yes. It will carry the posture of standing rather than crawling. It will operate from the settled confidence of someone who learned, through the most exhausting cycle of their spiritual life, that the father who hears the first time does not require the 1000th. The desk is clear. The document is collected. The waiting room is empty. And the person who walked out of the office carrying what was always signed is not the same person who walked in carrying what was never needed. The rehearsed plea, the desperate performance, the theology of insufficiency that said the Father required more asking before the pen would move. The pen moved first. It always moves first. And the child who just learned that will never beg again. Subscribe to this channel, so that every time God signs a yes over your life, the announcement reaches you before the begging cycle has time to install itself between the signature and the collection. You are not someone who begs anymore. You are someone who collects. And the next message carries the next signed document from a father whose pen moves before his child's mouth opens. Because the yes was always the default, and the begging was never the requirement. Type collected if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the document was signed on the first asking, the desk was never empty, the door was never locked, the begging was never required, and the Father who signed yes before the 1000th repetition is the same Father who will sign yes before the first word of the next prayer you bring to a desk where your name is always recognized and the pen is always ready.